All right, this is the video that will go over the first page of the expressions and equations study guide. This is for problems 1 through 9. So you need to make sure you've got your study guide, and the assumption here is that it's completed and you are ready to go over it. And you need something to grade it with, okay, to correct your mistakes, to fill in parts where you weren't sure, something to kind of just make notes along the way, all right? So let's go ahead and get going. All right, so the first problem really was having you work with exponents. And so you needed to kind of figure out, based on the directions, decide if the equation is true or false, and prove it. And you had this space over here to prove it, and you had a true or false option here that you were to circle one or the other. So you were basically trying to figure out, is this 3 to the 4th power the same as what's on the right, 81? Now, the assumption here with exponents is that you remembered that exponents are really repeated multiplication. So when you see 3 to the 4th power, the base is always what you want to multiply by, and the exponent is how many times. So 3 to the 4th power is really 4 threes, okay? And you're multiplying those threes. 3 times 3 times 3 times 3. And if you multiply that, you really do get 81. So this one was true, okay? The first one was true. That is right on. The second one here, 8 to the 2nd power, you want to repeatedly multiply 8 2 times. Well, if you do 8 2 times, you get 64. And they say over here 16. That's not true, okay? So you should have circled false. If you thought it was true, sometimes students do one of two things when they're making that mistake. They multiply the base and the exponent. 8 times 2 is 16, but that's not what this represents. The other thing students sometimes do is they realize this is 8 2 times, but instead of multiplying those two, they might add them. And they might say 8 plus 8, which is, again, that's not what exponents are getting us to do. So this one was false. In the third one right here, you had to recognize this word and know what it meant, because sometimes they give you the exponent and sometimes they give you something like cubed or squared. Now remember, a cube is a 3-dimensional shape, okay? So that means that when you see this word here, that exponent is 3, okay? So 10 to the 3rd power is really the same as 10 cubed. So if you do that, this would be a true one, because it's really 10 to the 3rd power. So you multiply 10 3 times, and we get 1,000. So that one was good. And the last one here, well, if cubes are 3-dimensional shapes, squares are 2-dimensional shapes. So that's why 6 squared is really 6 to the 2nd power. And you would multiply 6 2 times, and you get 36. So true, false, true, true. In the second one, you were to evaluate the expression and show your work. Now, I know you can use calculators, but you should still, on your paper, document what you were doing. You should show the steps you were taking to get there. But look down here, they gave you a fraction to the 5th power, and then over here, they gave you a decimal to the 3rd power. So you had to first kind of realize what this really represents. 1/2 would be your base, and your exponent was 5. So 1/2 multiplied 5 times. Now, remember, when you multiply fractions, you really just multiply your numerators, and then you multiply your denominators. So if I keep doing 1 times 1 times 1 times 1 times 1, I get 1. And if I do 2 times 2, well, that's 4. Times 2 is 8. Times 2 is 16. Times another 2 is 32. I get 1 over 32. Okay. Now you could have also done a decimal thing, like you could have done 0.5 times 0.5 times 0.5 times 0.5 times 0.5, and you'll get something different, but it should be equivalent to 1 over 32. On this one right here, you got to realize that you want 3/10 multiplied 3 times. So 0.3 times 0.3 times 0.3. And with this one, if you multiply that through, you get, let me get that out of the way. If you do 3/10 times 3/10, you get 9/100. Again, remember when multiplying decimals, to figure out where your decimal point goes in your answer, look at the number of numbers to the right of your decimal point. And there's 1 here and 1 here. So I go over 2 times, and it ends up in front of the 0. So that's 9/100. Then I take that 900 and I multiply it by the third 3/10. So I would get this, and now if I look at my values, I have 2 decimal numbers, I have 1 decimal number, that's 3 total. So I go over 3 spaces and put it in between those zeros. So the answer to this one is 27 thousandths. Number 3, come up with a power whose value is between 15 and 45. Prove that it's between 15 and 45. Now there's a whole bunch of answers you could come up with. You can see over here it says answers may vary because there's a whole bunch of options for this one, but basically you want to come up with a power, that's a fancy way of saying a base and an exponent whose value is between these two numbers. Now there's a whole bunch of options. Okay, you could do 4 squared because that's 16, that's between this. 5 squared works, 6 squared works. 7 squared would not, so I did not list it. But then I could also do some other ones. 2 to the 4th power, well, that's 16. 2 to the 5th power, well, that's 32. I could do 3 cubed. That's in between 15 and 45. Or I could also do something like this, because if you think about it, any number to the 1st power is that number. So I could have done 39 to the 1st power. I could have done 15 to the 1st power, whatever. There's a lot of options here. Make sure that yours works. All right, in numbers 4 and 5, you had to define a variable first and then write a phrase that shows what's going on. So let's look at this first one, number 4. 4 times more money than Elliot saved. The variable usually is what we don't know. We want to represent what we don't know with a variable. Well, here the unknown is how much money Elliot saved. So the first thing you do is you define that variable. And I said E, and that's going to represent the amount that Elliot saved. Now, sometimes people write E equals Elliot's savings. E equals Elliot's money. You could use a different letter, but you want to define that variable first. And the second part of that is we want to show the expression. Well, we want 4 times what Elliot saved. So if I know what Elliot saved, I really want that variable times 4. So I can do 4E. I can do 4.E to show multiplication. But that's how I would do number 4. Number 5, 3 more than half of the points the Panthers scored. So think, what is the first thing I don't know here? Well, I don't know what the Panthers scored. It doesn't tell me if it was 10 points or 50 points or what. So that is what we want to define as our variable. We want the amount that the Panthers scored. Now you might use P for that, for Panthers. You might use S for their score. But once you've established that, go back to the wording here. 3 more, well, that's adding 3. 3 more than half of what they scored. Well, half of something is what they scored divided by 2. So it might look something like this. The Panthers score divided by 2 plus 3. Or sometimes people show that division like this. P over 2 plus 3. All right, there's 4 and 5. All right, for 6 through 9, you had to evaluate the expressions, and they gave you the values of X, Y, and C. They wanted you to show your work and circle your answer. So I have a lot of steps going on for each problem here, but you should have shown similar work. Doesn't have to be exactly like mine, but you should have shown your steps and you should have ended up in the right spot. I put these down here to remind you what the order of operations are. Sometimes people remember, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. Sometimes people remember grouping symbols, and then exponents, multiply and divide, and add subtract. But remember the order of ops, because we all want to get the same answer. In number 6, the first thing I did was I substituted my values. So I plugged in a value for C and for Y. So I just rewrote it with the numbers substituted. Then I think about what needs to happen first. Well, the parentheses should happen first, and that's going to be 10 squared minus 7 times 7. Then I want to solve my exponent, and that'll be 100. And I want to subtract this part right here. That'll be 49. So really, I'm doing 100 minus 49, which is 51. Now, if you didn't get that, you want to pause and look for your mistake and see if you can figure out where you went off track. Number 7, again, first step is substitute the values for C X, and X. So I plugged in the 8, the 5, and the 5. I also added brackets because of when I plugged in the 8, I kind of used parentheses there, so I used brackets now instead of those parentheses up top, which is okay. And then I want to multiply, and I get 80, and I want to add with that the division part, because division comes before the adding. So that's really 80 plus 1, and I still have this divided by 4. So that's 81 divided by 4. And I can do a calculator for that part of it, or I can show my division over here, but I would get 20 and a fourth, or 20.25. 4 goes into 81, 20 times and a little bit more, okay? In 8 and 9, they switch the values on you. A is 2, B is 8, and C is a half, 5/10. Again, we got to show our work, and we want to circle our answers. So the first thing, again, substitute the numbers. Just show it with the numbers plugged in now. And then go through your steps. Well, I have no parentheses really. This is just keeping these numbers separate. There's nothing to do here yet. But I start with my exponent, an 8 to the second power. Well, that's 64 divided by 2, minus the rest of the problem. And now I have some division that I could do and some multiplication that I can do. So I get 32 over here, and I get 10 over here. So that really becomes 32 minus 10. And the last step is to just subtract and get 22. In number 9, I have A plus the product of B and C. And I'm going to start with the product of B and C. I want to multiply those first. So 8 times a half, well, you can think of that as half of 8. That's 4. So really, this is 2 plus 4. And that ends up being 6. So that is the reminder of that section. Keep in mind the order of operations, substitute first, and then show your steps. Circle answers, that helps kind of just show where you ended up. Now, that brings to a close the end of part 1. The second video will be the second page, the back side, and that is where we'll cut this off.